Hi everybody and welcome to this documentary on Timeline. My name's Dan Snow and I want to tell you about History Hit TV. It's like the Netflix for history. Hundreds of exclusive documentaries and interviews with the world's best historians. We've got an exclusive offer available to fans of Timeline. If you go to History Hit TV, you can either follow the information below this video or just Google History Hit TV and use the code TIMELINE. You get a special introductory offer. Go and check it out. In the meantime, enjoy this video.
In mathematics, every problem has a solution. You're either right or you are wrong. You can write a composition and there's no right or wrong about it. The grammar could be correct and the thought on paper not correct. Not in math. Mathematics is the poetry of the universe. Every now and then it unveils the discovery of a data point that is off on its own, separate from others. Mathematicians call that an outlier. It's something unique and sometimes unexplainable, outside the norm. Katherine Johnson is an outlier.
I like to count. I counted everything. After going to church, I counted the steps to church. 16 steps to going upstairs to my second floor. And I counted them every time as if they might change. But it was just became a habit.
Fueled by her love of mathematics, the little girl who liked to count ultimately carved out her place in the history of the United States space program. From America's first manned space flight to the Space Shuttle, her computations were instrumental. The trajectory of her life is one almost no one would have predicted. Katherine was born in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, a mathematical genius nurtured by a father who cultivated crops and a love of learning. Her mother was a seamstress who took in laundry. Joshua and Joylette Coleman had 4 children, Horace, Margaret, Charles, and Catherine, the youngest, born on August 26, 1918. While her sister mostly stayed inside and helped their mother, Catherine preferred to be outside, doing whatever the boys did.
Threw rocks, among other things. But he played kids play. But he said to a child one day who was picking on me, he said, "Don't run away from her." He said, "'Cause she can nail you with a rock." And I could. So she could pick on me standing close, but if she went away, bam. But that was one of the things I learned playing with boxes, with boys, how to defend yourself. So I was always prepared.
A precocious child, Catherine was only 10 when she was academically ready for high school. But schools were segregated then, and 8th grade was as far as a black child could go in the rural area where they lived. Undeterred, Joshua moved his wife and children about 130 miles west so that Catherine and her siblings could earn high school diplomas at the West Virginia Colored Institute. Joshua stayed back at the family home on Church Street in White Sulphur Springs, where the family reunited during the summer breaks and holidays. These were the years of the Great Depression. Income from the farm wasn't enough to support the family and pay for the education of 4 children. So Joshua worked as a bellman at the world-renowned Greenbrier Resort. And when they were home, family members worked there too. Katherine worked as a presser, ironing the gowns of Illuminati that frequented the five-star resorts. Daughter Kathy Moore recalls a favorite family story.
Well, it had just happened that she was in the room with one of the guests who was French, and she was on the phone talking. And when she got off, she looked at my mother and she said, "You understood every word I said, didn't you?" she said. So she took her to this gentleman and she said, "She's going to be taking French 2 next year. Let's see if we can help her." And he took her downstairs to the chef, and he worked with her all summer. And when she got back to school, the teacher thought she had been to France because her accent was so perfect and she was so fluent.
Catherine Creola Coleman finished high school at the age of 14 and enrolled at the all-black West Virginia State College on the same campus as her high school. In 1937, at the age of 18, she had not 1 but 2 college degrees, summa cum laude, one in mathematics, the other in French. One of her professors was Dr. William Shefflin Claytor, a mathematical genius in his own right.
The math professor was a younger PhD himself, and he was good. And he would get after me for, "Why don't you ask me questions? And I know you know the answer." I said, "Well, they're kids here. I can look at them and tell they want to ask a question, but they're afraid to, so I ask it for them." He said, "I knew there was some stupid reason because you're always asking questions and I know you know the answer."
Only the 3rd African American to earn a doctorate in math, Claytor pushed her academically, creating classes just for her, and he challenged her to pursue a career as a research mathematician.
When Katherine worked with William Claytor actually created courses for her because she completed all of the courses that were offered to her. He told her, you will go on and do research in mathematics. She asked, "There's no job out there for me." William Claytor knew that dilemma because when he graduated from with his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, he only had one job. That was at West Virginia State University, which is a historically black college. He couldn't get a job anywhere else, even though he received national praise for his thesis and his research work. Nobody would hire him. So Katherine Johnson telling him, "There's no job out there for me," that didn't stop him. He told her, "You have to figure that out," as did he.
Unfortunately, a career as a research mathematician was about as real as the man on the moon. In those days, only 2% of all black women earned college degrees. Among white women, the number was 10%. Career opportunities for educated young women of any race were rather limited. So she did what most did and became a teacher. Her first assignment was at the Carnegie High School in Marion, Virginia, just across the border from West Virginia. Katherine challenged her students.
She taught me in the 5th grade, and she was a real good teacher. I enjoyed her classes. She had a way of making classes fun or very interesting. She wanted you to be all you could be. I mean, that was one of her conversations, maybe once a month, that we achieve whatever we can to make it in the world. She always told us, you have to do your best. Make sure you do your best. And she just treated us really, really like her children.
In the state of Virginia, black teachers didn't earn what their white counterparts did. But that was not the case back in her home state of West Virginia. So in 1939, Katherine accepted an offer to teach in Morgantown at Monongalia High School, the county's first high school for blacks. The school had a brand new building, dedicated only a year earlier with the keynote address by Eleanor Roosevelt. With her move, Katherine's salary doubled to $110 a month. Her teaching stint in Virginia, however, had paid other dividends. It's where she met a handsome college student who was home on break. Before she left for Morgantown, she and Jimmy Goebel got married. Secretly. No one knew, not even their parents. In those days, married women weren't allowed to teach.
Well, I think one of the things we have to remember is that now it's absolutely no big deal for a married woman to continue whatever profession that she has, to continue teaching or to continue working in her job. Back in those days, the expectation was that women, married women, would simply quit. They were in some cases, and probably most cases, explicitly barred for continuing their job after they were married.
While she was teaching in Morgantown, a deal was brokered in the halls of the state capitol in Charleston. The president of her alma mater, John W. Davis, and the governor of West Virginia, Homer Holt, agreed to quietly integrate the state's graduate school education by opening up classes at West Virginia University, which was also located in Morgantown. Katherine was one of 3 African Americans handpicked to integrate the master's level programs offered by West Virginia University. The other 2 were males, school principals who had been accepted into law school. She enrolled in the summer term of 1940. At the end of the semester, Katherine and Jimmy found out they were expecting their first child. Keeping their marriage a secret was no longer possible, and neither was grad school. Daughter Joylette was later followed by daughters Connie and Kathy. The family made their home in Bluefield, West Virginia, and Jimmy taught high school science. As the girls grew and the rules changed about married women teaching, Katherine went back to the classroom too.
There was a much greater participation on the part of Black women in the workforce than white women. In a household where the income expectations were lower, obviously as many people as could participate as possible meant that your household had a greater chance of moving ahead. So it was a much greater expectation that the Black women, if they had the opportunity, would continue to teach. They would continue to contribute to their families. So there was a little bit of a different expectation in terms of a woman not just deciding to work, but really feeling obligated to work in order to provide a better future for her children.
She and Jimmy both taught at Tazewell High School in southwestern Virginia. Summers were spent back in White Sulphur Springs. Sundays were for church, and later in the afternoon, the family often took walks around the fish hatchery.
We found fun even in those days of segregation and being poor. We never used that word. We never felt poor. We were rich in family. Our church life and school it was a joy to go to school, play hooky. We didn't do those kinds of activities. Everything was centered around family and school and making your parents and grandparents proud.
In 1952, a family member encouraged Katherine to apply for a government job in Hampton Roads, Virginia, with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or the NACA.
The NACA tried to improve how airplanes flew by doing research and the mathematics of aerodynamics. So, for instance, they came up with a really fundamental set of tables of airfoil shapes, which is that profile of what a wing looks like. That was then very helpful to airplane manufacturers when they needed to improve the efficiency of their airplanes.
The NACA worked out of the Langley Air Force Base. A primary focal point of its research was a full-scale wind tunnel. Engineers could put an entire airplane inside the wind tunnel and piece by piece reduce the drag on the airplane to learn how to make it more aerodynamic. The research spun out a lot of data and created a demand for computers.
Before a computer was a machine, a computer was a person. It was a function. And what you had was when you were doing research that brought in gobs of data, you needed someone who could go through it and what was called reduce it, which meant turning it from the raw numbers that came out of the tests into something that the engineers could use.
The job required a high level of mathematical ability, knowledge of complex algebra and geometry to accurately solve nested equations and differential equations.
The category of computers was created in some ways as a cost-saving and labor-saving device. This is the equivalent of the secretarial pool, but with math. So computers were considered sub-professionals, as their job title was called. So not someone who might have a path into a professional track, but who would, on a regular basis, just be doing the work of these equations and reducing the data. Computers were useful to the NACA because they cost less money. As sub-professionals who were not paid at the same level that a junior engineer would have been paid, who was doing pretty much the same work but with a path into the engineering field, these women then were seen in some ways as classic pink-collar labor. Lower cost, high skill, and ultimately very good results, but without all of the professional acumen that was given to the men.
Men didn't have the patience. So they didn't ask the men to do it, they asked women to do it. Had rooms of women computers.
The computers were overwhelmingly white women, but during World War II, when the NACA couldn't find enough white women with advanced mathematical skills to fuel the demand, the door cracked open for African American women. An executive order issued in 1941 by President Roosevelt also forbid discrimination in the defense industries.
African Americans started being recruited into the computing field in the 1940s as a part of the staffing up of that to handle this drag reduction program that was being done and all of the work that they were doing for the war effort. And in some ways, as they got into the 1950s and 1960s, having a group of African American computers both satisfied federal interests in having a more integrated workforce with people of different races working in federal employ, and at the same time the state laws and also just mores of Virginia of having that segregated. So there was a group that came to be known as the West Computers, part of a new group that was developed in the 1940s. African American women with mathematics and science degrees from colleges and universities who then could be a pool of people that would be a resource to all of the engineering projects at the NACA.
Although this was a federal installation, the Jim Crow laws of Virginia required racial segregation in virtually all aspects of life, in schools, in hospitals, in graveyards, and there at in the workrooms of what was then called the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory. So when the first black women were hired in 1943, they were segregated into what was called the West Area Computing Office. And that was as distinct from the East Area Computing Office on the east side of the Langley campus at that time, where the white women worked. So they were segregated in their own office. They were required to use the colored bathrooms. They sat at the colored table in the cafeteria.
Katherine applied to NACA in 1952. Not surprisingly, she passed all the employment tests. However, she was told the quota had been filled and to come back next year. She did. Katherine joined the NACA in 1953 and was assigned to the West Computer Group, an all-African American group of female mathematicians. Coincidentally, she went to work under the supervision of another woman who had grown up in West Virginia, Dorothy Vaughan. Just 2 weeks into working there, Katherine was assigned to the Flight Research Division.
One of her first projects was on an airplane that fell out of the sky. Right? That's how it was described. The airplane was a small general aviation size aircraft. It was flying along, and suddenly it crashes. And there was an investigation. The NACA is called in to help investigate. And Katherine did many of the calculations that proved that what actually had happened was this small airplane had flown through the wake turbulence. The turbulence that comes off of an airplane, particularly a bigger airplane, can be very powerful, like little tornadoes that come off the wingtips. This plane had gone into the turbulence and been destroyed, been thrown out of control and broken up and crashed, and the people were killed. It was known that turbulence existed. It wasn't known how long it could last and how powerful it could be. So she basically did the research and writes up the report. The engineer who she was working under actually signs the report, and it was assigned to him. But she did the basic work on it. And as a result of that, the government changed the rules for how far apart planes have to be when they're flying through the air. Those rules are still in use today.
Katherine Johnson's skill set were a very good match, I think, not just with the actual kind of work that they were doing in the Flight Research Division, but also temperamentally. She was a very good fit with the people working there. So as she tells it, they borrowed her from the pool and they forgot to send her back. She was a very good fit. And so that was the beginning of, a trajectory that would eventually take her through the heart of the American space program.
Hired for her mathematical prowess, Katherine's brilliant, inquisitive mind was paired with a personality to match. It wasn't long before she began to break barriers. Meanwhile, her husband Jimmy took a job in the bustling shipyards of Newport News, which paid a great deal more than a teacher's salary. In 1 week, he could bring home as much as he did in 1 month as a teacher. The family settled in their home in a segregated part of town, the Newsom Park subdivision in Hampton. But it wasn't long before Jimmy became ill and passed away in December 1956 of cancer.
My dad was sick for about 2.5 years. He died, passed away in 56. Jolette was 10th grade. Connie and I were in probably 8th grade. Jolette might have been a junior, but we were in high school. After Dad died, our mother was our role model because she said, "You have to go to school, I have to go to work. We'll grieve together, but we're going to get this done because you promised him you'd finish school." And we all did. We all pulled together, graduated from high school. But in the midst of the grief, I guess 3 years later, it's when that handsome soldier came on the scene. And the minister at our church said, "Miss Gold, I have somebody I want you to meet."
Enter Lieutenant Colonel James A. Johnson, who Katherine married on August 22nd of 1959. It was quite a time career-wise, too. The agency she worked for, now called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was working feverishly to catch up to the Soviets in space exploration. This was the time period of the Cold War. With tensions running high between the U.S. and Soviet Union, there was a considerable concern militarily when the Soviets beat the U.S. into space. American pride also took a hit when the Soviets were the first to launch an unmanned satellite into orbit around the Earth, Sputnik 1, which they launched on October 4th, 1957.
It causes a pretty big stir. What actually I think causes a bigger stir is a month later they launch not just a metal ball into space, but a capsule with a dog on board. And what does that imply about first their technological skills and abilities, and also what their plans are for the future? They're already launching a dog in space. Clearly they're planning on launching probably people into space pretty soon. So that shock in late 1957 for the United States, generates this dynamic of the Soviets doing amazing things, and they did do amazing things on quite a shoestring, and the United States responding. And this dynamic goes on where the Soviets kept finding ways to do things that were dramatic, that they could do before the United States could do, and they could claim a victory.
The space race was in full fury, and Katherine was in the thick of it. She was the only non-white, non-male member of the Space Task Force whose mission was to get American astronauts into space in as short a time as possible.
People were building bomb shelters, digging holes underneath their houses and building bomb shelters. People were concerned. We had duck and cover drills where kids in school would hide under their desks just in case there was a nuclear attack. It was an environment where people were, afraid that the world might end at any time, particularly after 1957 or so, when the Soviets did actually perfect their ability to deliver nuclear weapons to the United States with ballistic missiles, and then you wind up with both sides building up, arsenals of ballistic missiles that shoot at each other. So people were concerned, and it was a high threat environment. And the space race becomes a surrogate for a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so people realized that the accomplishments or the failures in space are sort of the battleground between communist ideology and the Western democratic model.
As engineers and scientists worked frantically to catch up with and hopefully catapult ahead of the Soviets, NASA announced its first group of astronauts, known as the Mercury 7. A media frenzy erupted, and the nation cheered, eager for the U.S. to be the first to put a man into space. But once again, the Soviets placed first. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space on April 12, 1961. He also successfully completed an orbit around the Earth. 3 weeks later, on May 5, 1961, the U.S. launched the first American in space, 37-year-old astronaut Alan Shepard. His one-man Mercury spacecraft, dubbed Freedom 7, was 8 stories tall and only 6 feet wide. It blasted into space and rose in an arc 116 miles above the Earth's surface. Then splashed down in the Atlantic Ocean. Total flight time, 15 minutes and 28 seconds.
Alan Shepard's flight, of course, in May of 1961, was a suborbital ballistic flight. So he launches from Cape Canaveral Air Force Station now, out over the Atlantic Ocean, parabola basically, and comes back down and splashes down in the ocean. And they needed someone to calculate, the trajectory. Where is he going to be, at what speed, at what time? Most critically, where is he going to land? Because he's going to land in his capsule, and we need to have somebody there to pick him up and get him out of the water. Because we're not sure will the capsule float very well. In fact, on one of the missions, we lost the capsule. It sank the very next mission, the second one with Gus Grissom. So it was critical to know, all the parameters of the flight and understand, how high would it go, where would you point the tracking equipment, and where do you put the recovery forces. And so Katherine was the one who did the calculations for that, calculated, if you start at this point with this much thrust and you thrust for this long at these levels, and it cuts off at this point, what's the highest point going to be? Where is he going to land? All those, what's the timing? And so she calculated the trajectory for his flight. A very critical thing.
Decades after Shepard's flight, in an interview with Researcher News, Katherine said, quote, "Early on, when they said they wanted the capsule to come down at a certain place, they were trying to compute when it should start. I said, let me do it. You tell me where you want it to land, and I'll do it backwards and tell you when to take off." That was my forte. Although you won't find her name in any articles written by mainstream media at the time of Shepard's flight, Some in the black press took note. A week after Shepard's flight, reporter James Hicks wrote in the New York Amsterdam News, "At NASA, they are loud in their praise of a young West Virginia-born Negro girl who has prepared a science paper that was not only a key document in the flight of Commander Shepard into outer space, but which will actually become the key document if and when we are able to put an astronaut into orbit." There was no questioning Katherine's calculations, which were always spot on. But there were always plenty of questions in her.
We were working on space problems, and they just got shifted to me by some means. And they would have briefings among the engineers as to what they were going to do next. And I asked to go to one of them. Well, the women don't go to the briefings. I said, is there a law? Let it go. So I went to all the meetings that the men had, and I knew what I was doing all the time, and where they were going, and so on.
As we all know, once you are in that room, the room where it happens, that's when you're really able to take off. If you don't have the access, it will be very difficult for you to achieve, move up in the organization and really understand the heart of what your organization is trying to do. If you're in that room and you are seeing the decisions get made and you're able to contribute to those decisions, that's when you are getting close to the heart of the work.
And I apparently asked the right questions. And so I got gradually into the group. I met with the engineers all the time. And it was a pleasure to know what they were doing and why. And then I would have suggestions, which they would accept, no big deal. She said it. And I went from that to whatever was next. And gradually, I was always in the meeting with the men. That was new. Women didn't meet. The computers didn't meet with the engineers. And it proceeded constantly like that, so that I was always in the right place at the right time.
She also had the right stuff, namely her mathematical brilliance.
Katherine Johnson brought her knack for analytic geometry, which is essentially looking at figures in some sort of coordinate system. We could think about, let's say, the geometry of the Earth. We can think about the Earth as a ball, so we can see it as a sphere. In this case, we would have something called spherical geometry. And so she can think about different sorts of geometries and think about how we can put trajectories in those different spaces. And then she was able to connect different types of geometry, different figures, to actually push the envelope and make the calculations work.
After Shepard's flight, NASA's next challenge was to put a man into orbit around the Earth. The agency was relying less on human computers and more on mechanical ones to calculate the complex orbital equations that would control the spacecraft. The transition from humans to machines made some uneasy, including the astronauts who were trusting their lives to the accuracy of the calculations.
And there were a lot of concerns about the computers, these IBM computers they were relying on for John Glenn's flight, because you had to have them, they had to be able to work, and they had to be able to feed the data back and forth to the space capsule rapidly in a way that human computers couldn't do. So the question was, how are we sure that the data the computer's giving us is good? Because there were some cases where they ran the computer data and it didn't seem to come out right. So as they're discussing this problem, the engineers at NASA scratching their heads over what are we going to do about this. And in the course of this discussion, John Glenn's involved in the discussion because, of course, he's concerned about, is this computer going to work the way I want it to work? It depends on whether I get home safely or not. And he said, well, have the girl check the numbers. Now, have the girl check the numbers. We know for a fact that John Glenn actually said that. And we've checked with John Glenn. He confirmed that he, in fact, actually said that. A number of other people have also, confirmed that that's what happened. There's some context. The girl, right? Computers at that time were all women, and they were all referred to as the girl, right? But when John Glenn was talking about the girl, it was very clear who he meant, because Katherine Johnson was the girl when you talked about trajectory calculations. So when he said, have the girl check the numbers, it was very clear that he meant, I want Katherine to go there and do this calculation.
After weeks of launch delays, some for mechanical problems, others for adverse weather conditions, it was finally all systems go on February 20th, 1962. Astronaut John Glenn rocketed from Cape Canaveral, Florida, into space and became the first American to orbit the Earth, flying the Friendship 7 mission. From liftoff to splashdown, John Glenn's successful flight lasted just under 5 hours. It had taken Katherine nearly 6 months to produce the formula that allowed scientists to continually track the path of Glenn's orbit around the Earth. It had taken her a couple of days to double-check the math the machine computer had spit out, giving Glenn the confidence he needed before strapping himself in. After all, the odds of his survival were estimated at 1 in 6.
The first time that a human being goes into space and orbits the Earth, it's an entirely different kind of flying. It is an order of magnitude harder than a suborbital space flight that just goes up into space and splashes back down hundreds of miles away. And so I think the fact that Katherine Johnson was asked for to double check all of those numbers before John Glenn went into space speaks both to her reputation, but also to an unease about the transition to these black boxes where you put in numbers and got out results and didn't really know exactly what had happened to them in between, in a way that she could always explain what she had done, and they knew that she understood all of the equations that she was working with.
John Glenn became a national hero, complete with a ticker tape parade in New York City celebrating his mission. Katherine's contributions were celebrated in the black press. Quotes one newspaper, 2 Negroes played prominent roles in the history-making orbital flight of U.S. astronaut John Glenn. One of them was a brilliant woman mathematician who is credited with helping to devise the highly complex tracking system which enabled scientists to predict within 2 miles the location of Lieutenant Colonel Glenn's rocket cone upon its return to Earth after 3 orbits around the Earth. Although her name didn't make headlines, Katherine's mathematical genius helped to propel America's soaring space program. The first research paper she co-authored was 34 pages entitled The Determination of Azimuth Angle at Burnout for Placing a Satellite Over a Selected Earth Position. At the time it was published, NASA was moving its Space Command Center to Houston, Texas, and the engineer that Katherine had been collaborating with for years, Ted Skopinski, was in the midst of moving his office and his family there. She had decided to stay in Hampton and had more time to devote to finishing the report. An important one, laying out the next phase of the space program.
So when the big boss came around looking and asking Ted Skopinski, well, what about that research report? When are you going to have it on my desk? He said, listen, Katherine's working on it, and I think that she should get credit. She's done the work anyway. So here we had an instance of an engineer who worked very closely with her, who not only recognized her talent in in the context of their working relationship, but really pushed for everyone else to recognize it as well and for her to get the credit that she deserved. So that was a real barrier-breaking moment for that particular group. And, it was a really key document in that early part of the space program.
It was a landmark achievement for a woman, and an African-American woman in particular, to get that level of credit. Published 9 months before Shepard's flight, it was the first paper out of the Space Division that had a woman's name on it. In all, Katherine co-authored 26 scientific papers. Their titles and corresponding computations and diagrams are as cerebral as you would expect from a research mathematician. The orbital behavior of the Echo 1 satellite and its rocket casing during the first 500 days. Approximate solutions for the flight path angle of a re-entry vehicle in the upper atmosphere. Mid-course and approach guidance requirements for simplified onboard control of moon-to-Earth trajectories.
So the fact that Katherine Johnson, as an African-American woman, was co-author on some of these technical papers says something very important about how much she was seen as a real collaborator in the actual engineering that was being done, and how much of that work was really hers, that even in that era when it would have been customary not to credit the woman, the computer, this African-American woman was co-author on these papers and really gained a reputation, especially in the 70s and 1980s, as one of the pioneers and premier leaders of this field.
Getting your name on a research report is a really big deal, and it's also a public acknowledgement that your fingerprints are on that work. And that's what the women wanted, who were ambitious and loved their work, just like the men. They wanted their name on the report. I've done the work. I want to see evidence that you acknowledge that I've done the report.
Weeks after Glenn's successful mission, President John F. Kennedy went before a special joint session of Congress and boldly challenged the nation to put a man on the moon.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
Kennedy went to Congress on that day, and he basically gave a new State of the Union address. He had had these political problems and various setbacks, and he basically was doing a reset. Okay, here are a bunch of things that we can do to improve the situation with the United States. And there were actually a number of different projects he proposed, and that kind of went out there. In that speech, the one it's most remembered for is the moon landing declaration. But if you listen to the wording carefully, he actually is asking Congress, I think we should do this. If you were willing to appropriate the money, it's going to be hard, but if you appropriate the money, I think we can do this, and this will be a great thing.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3.
It would take 7 years to achieve that vision.
0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
On the morning of July 16th, 1969, Apollo 11 took off from the Kennedy Space Center. 12 minutes later, its crew of Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins is in Earth orbit. After a lap and a half, it's a go for the moon. And on July 20th, 500 million people watched, spellbound, as the Eagle, or lunar module, touched down with only 30 seconds of fuel remaining. Hours later, Neil Armstrong became the first man to set foot on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
It was an historic achievement. Apollo 11's flight path required calculating the rotation of the Earth, the moon's rotation around the Earth, and the spacecraft entering lunar orbit. While orbiting the moon, the lunar lander had to separate from the command module, land safely on the moon, then 22 hours later reattach with the command module that was orbiting overhead. While the nation was focused on getting to the moon and beating the Russians, NASA was even more concerned about getting the astronauts back. If the lunar module launched at the wrong time or with the wrong force, if it didn't hook back up with the spacecraft, there wasn't another one coming. The math had to be spot on. It was. After all, it was built upon Katherine's work.
Her work early on setting the standard for all that stuff was important. Some research work that she did on rendezvous work, for example, she did a really important paper on, how would a spacecraft, the reverse of the John Glenn return to Earth problem. How do you get from the surface of a planet to meet up with a spacecraft up in outer space? She'd done the initial work on that, and that paper was really critical to the Apollo program because it required launching off the moon to rendezvous with the command module and bring the crew safely home.
Apollo 11's triumphant return was mission accomplished. It was followed 4 months later by Apollo 12 in November 1969. It too went as planned. Then came Apollo 13. Intended to be the third trip to the moon, the mission had to be aborted just 2 days in, on April 13th, 1970, when an explosion ripped through one of the oxygen tanks, crippling the spacecraft.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
The command module's normal supply of electricity, light, and water was lost about 200,000 miles from Earth. For 4 days, the nation was on edge, and NASA engineers, scientists, and technicians were challenged to the limits of their knowledge. Could we get the astronauts home safe?
Katherine Johnson really made a name for herself within NASA as a go-to person for orbital mechanics. And one of the things that happened with the Apollo 13 mission when they needed to reroute that craft and bring those gentlemen safely back to Earth is that they were doing a lot of unexpected math very quickly in the moment that needed to be right. That's not how NASA usually worked. NASA had made their reputation and still works very much on anticipating problems, planning for them, testing them, and knowing before a problem happens what the answer will be so that they can do that in the moment. Apollo 13 really threw people back on having to do new solutions in the moment that they knew had to work and on which lives relied. And Katherine Johnson then was seen as somebody who could reliably do that, who could think on her feet, who knew the material well enough, who knew the math well enough, that if she said that this orbital trajectory would work and in fact would help bring those gentlemen back to Earth on a free return around the moon, that it would work.
With the on-board mechanical computers out, NASA fell back to a series of reports that Katherine had co-authored 3 years earlier with her colleague, Al Hamer.
She developed a method for, using, quick calculations with, looking at stars with, a sextant or sighting the stars to determine where your position was in space and what your attitude was. Critical things for how to navigate in space if your guidance computer is inoperative for some reason. And in fact, there was a case where the guidance computer was inoperative on Apollo 13. They had to turn off the electricity, which they turned off the computers, and they were flying, ballistically around the moon. There was, no guidance until they turned the computer back on. Her technique would have been very useful, except for one thing. When the service module exploded, it set a whole bunch of debris around, and so the Apollo 13 craft was flying around the moon with a cloud of bits and pieces around it that you really made it difficult to distinguish what those were and what the stars were.
Everybody think
Scrambling and improvising around the clock, NASA held its collective breath until the crew of James Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes splashed down in the Pacific on April 19, 1970. NASA records the mission as a successful failure because of the experience gained in rescuing the crew. Katherine says she's proudest of her work on the Apollo missions. There were 17 in all, but her work did not stop there. She went on to contribute to the Space Shuttle program and the Earth Resources satellite. Johnson worked at NASA until 1986, a total of 33 years. The depth and breadth of the space program that she not only witnessed, but helped to shape is astonishing. The girl who liked to count became the woman who can hardly count her awards. They include the NASA Lunar Orbiter Award and 3 NASA Special Achievement Awards. She was named Mathematician of the Year in 1997 by the National Technical Association, and in 1999, she received an Alumni of the Year award from her alma mater, West Virginia State University.
In her 33 years at NASA, Katherine was a pioneer who broke the barriers of race and gender, showing generations of young people that everyone can excel in math and science and reach for the stars.
In November of 2015, Katherine was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, by President Barack Obama. On May 5, 2016, she returned to NASA Langley on the 55th anniversary of Shepard's historic flight to attend a ceremony where a $30 million computational research facility was named in her honor. As part of the event, Johnson also received a Silver Snoopy Award from Leland Melvin, a former astronaut. The award is given to people who have made outstanding contributions to flight safety and mission success.
I would say Katherine Johnson is a shero. You know, we have heroes, but we also have sheroes. So she's a role model. She's a shero, someone that, you know, men and women look up to, you know, young and old look up to as a person that's accomplished some incredible things, but she's done it with such humility and grace and honor.
It seems strange to think back that we lived with this lady, and for a long time we didn't know exactly what she did. She went to work because at the time it was secret work, but she didn't talk about it. And I was in college. Looked down and there's her picture looking at me on a newspaper. I called, "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" She said, "Kathy, I've been at NASA all this time. I'm just doing my job."
In 2016, her story and that of 2 of her colleagues went Hollywood in the film Hidden Figures.
I think one of the most profound lessons that I learned from Katherine Johnson is something that she told me and has told other people that she learned from her father. And that is the following: you are no better than anyone else, and no one is better than you.
Katherine Johnson is an outlier in that she was really there at the forefront, pushing the envelope to do more. When she was given a job to do, either performing calculations or computations, she would add more to what they were asking, and she would do more, and she would push to actually say, "Give me more, let me do more work," and she would do it very well. And then she would look for the next problem to solve.
X. I liked learning, and I was always concerned about the next step, whether I was going to use it or who was going to use it. But I was always concerned about the next step in any procedure that I was dealing with. But I liked learning myself. I still like to learn.